Hi guys, this video is going to be on music theory, and specifically it's going to be on how you can think about writing and improvising melodies. If that sounds unfamiliar to you, don't worry, because I'm going to try to provide some context before we get started. Okay, so I don't want to assume any background, so I'm going to start off with the very basics, and the first thing you really need to understand is what the notes are called on the keyboard. So there's 12 different notes, and I'm going to start by naming the white ones because those are the easiest. So the white keys go from A to G and then they repeat. So it goes A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and then you're back to A. And then the black keys you can get by adding a flat or a sharp to any of those notes. So flats will take you down or to the left on the keyboard. So you can go from A to A flat, and then sharps will take you down, up or to the right on the keyboard. So you can go from A to A sharp. Okay, so now that we know what the notes are called, I want to talk about intervals. An interval is just the name we give the distance between two notes, and the reason we talk about it is that it's usually easier to talk about the distance than the specific notes because the distance is always going to be the same regardless of where you start. So for example, the interval between a C and a B flat sounds like this. And the interval between an F and an E flat sounds like this. And so you can hear how the second interval kind of sounds like the first one, just shifted up a little bit. The reason I picked this interval in particular is because it sort of has a distinct character to it. So for example, you might be able to hear like a blues sound in the following sequence. And all I did was play the same interval over and over again, starting on different notes. So in the same way that you can name the same note a lot of different things, you can also name the same interval a lot of different things, and it all depends on the context of what you're talking about. So I'm not going to go over how to name intervals in this video because it's actually kind of a complicated topic, and it usually takes a while to teach in classes. So instead, I just want to emphasize the point that I'm going to be talking a lot about the distances in between notes instead of the specific notes that are being played, because you can take those patterns and apply them to any starting point, if that makes sense. Okay, so now that we know what intervals are, I'm going to talk about chords. Chords are just the name that we give any group of notes played at once. So for example, this would be a chord. And this chord consists of the notes A flat, C, and E flat. Now, because intervals are just the distance in between notes, you can think of chords in terms of the intervals they're made of. So for example, this chord that I just played has a couple different intervals within it. It's got the interval between the bottom note and the middle note, and then there's another interval between the middle and the top, and there's another interval between the bottom and the top. And this set of intervals is sort of a formula for a chord that sounds this way. So for example, I could take the same intervals in between the bottom, middle, and top notes and just start on a different note, and I would get this chord. And then if I did it again, I would get this chord. So these chords, it doesn't really matter, but these chords are all called major chords because of the intervals they're made of. And if I had changed the intervals to something like this, that would be a diminished chord, for example. Okay, so before we move on from chords, I just want to point out that chords are named for the notes they contain, but you can actually place those notes anywhere on the keyboard. So for example, the A flat major that I just played in the last section sounded like this. But I could also play it like this, and it would be the same chord. So all I did was repeat some of the notes and change some of their locations, but it's still the same chord. So just play whatever you think sounds nice. So you might have noticed that when I played the A flat major chord the second time and changed around some of the positions of the notes and repeated some, I actually only repeated one of the notes, and I repeated it multiple times. So to recap, the chord was this. And the note that I'm repeating 3 times here is A flat. It's here, here, and here. So the reason that I repeat the note so many times like that is because I want to provide some context for your ear so that when you hear the chord, you hear these other notes in relation to this note. And that concept carries over to pretty much any time you're playing a chord. There's usually one note that you can talk about as like the base of that chord. So we call that note the root. So this would be an A flat chord because its root is A flat. Okay, so the reason I'm talking about this is because when we think about melodies, it's going to make a lot of sense to think about them in terms of their relationship with the root of the chord. The reason we care about the relationship with the root of the chord is because the root is kind of the note that gives the chord its sound within the context of the entire song. And we want to play our melody within the context that the chord provides, because the chord is going to have a certain sound within the song. So, for example, if I were to play that same chord as before, an A flat major, again it sounds like this. And if I just play the root on top of that in terms like as a melody, it's going to sound like this. So you can see it's a nice sounding note, but it doesn't really add a lot to the character of the chord. In contrast, I could play a different note like a G and get a much different sound. So if I added a G to the melody, it might sound like this. So just to recap, the reason that I'm talking about intervals in that scenario is that now I can take that same logic and apply it to a different starting position, and I'll have an idea of what it'll sound like before I play it. So for example, I just played the chord A flat major, and I told you that when you play the root, it doesn't really add much to the chord because you're playing the same note that's already down here. Right? But when I played this other note, that note has a different interval with the root of the chord. Now, I can take that same logic, and if I go to a different starting position, I'll move to G flat. So the chord that I just played sounds like this. And here's the root of the chord in the melody. And you might already be able to hear what comes next, because now I'm going to play that same interval that I played before. Okay, so from this point on, I'm going to start actually naming some of the intervals that I'm playing. And if you're not familiar with these names, this might come off as a little bit confusing to you, but I would just remember that the important takeaway of this is that the intervals between the notes that you're playing in the melody and the rest of the notes you're playing in the chords, those intervals are going to be what gives your melody the sound that it has. So then, out of all those intervals that you have going on between the melody and the chord you're playing underneath it, the really important intervals that you want to think about are the intervals between the notes of the melody and the root of the chord. So now I want to apply some of these principles by looking at a classic jazz melody. And yeah, I'm just going to play it for you first. I'm going to try to play it, and then we can go into the intervals that exist within the melody and the chords. And we can talk about what makes the melody sound so great in terms of those intervals. So yeah, first I'm just going to try to play it. that's as far as I'll go, because that's plenty in terms of what I want to talk about. So now I want to talk about what the intervals are between the notes of the melody and the roots of the chords that I'm playing, and how those intervals can kind of help you understand what makes that melody both so simple and so pretty. So the first chord that I play is an F minor 7, and the note that I'm playing in the melody here is the third of the chord. So again, I said that I would start talking about the interval names now, because it's just going to be kind of difficult for me to go through this whole analysis without naming them. But again, the basic concept is that this interval between this note and this note has a certain sound that you could recreate over any starting position or any note that you have in the bottom here. And actually, that's exactly what happens in the next chord. So I start with this F minor 7 where I'm playing the third in the melody, and then I move to a B flat minor 7 where I'm playing the third in the melody. So again, I have this interval between the B flat and the D flat, B flat, D flat, and that's the same interval as between an F and an A flat. Okay, so far in the melody, with just the first two notes, all we have is thirds over the root of the chord, right? So we play the third here, and then we play the third here. Now, this is the first point in the melody where we're going to play a different interval over the root of the chord, because then the melody moves down to here. And the first note that I play here, that's a different interval over the B flat, right? So I started with a third over the B flat, and now I'm going to play a seventh over the B flat. And I move from this seventh over the B flat down to a seventh over my next chord. Down to a third over my next chord. This is the third of E flat. And then I move to a different chord, but I keep the same note in the melody. But now it's got a different interval with the root of the chord. So before, this note was the third of E flat, and now this note is the seventh of A flat. So again, in context, that sounds like this. So then you can see that I move from this seventh of A flat to the third of A flat. So you might start to notice a pattern here. From here, I move again back down to the seventh, and I do the same step downwards. So this note is again the third of the chord that I'm playing under it, and it becomes the seventh. And I move again from the seventh to the third, and finally I do this whole step downwards to the third thing one more time. So I move again from the seventh of this chord to the third of the chord under it. So yeah, that's as far as I'm going to go on analysis for this video, because I feel like that's plenty to understand in one go. So yeah, I hope that this video has been somewhat helpful in understanding how melodies work in terms of intervals. So to finish off the video, I just want to reiterate the idea that music theory is not a prescription for what you should play, or what chords sound objectively good, or what melodies sound objectively good. It's really just a tool for you to get new ideas about what to play and what to listen for. So I hope this video has been informative in that respect, and thank you for watching.